Hey scholars, welcome to the guided practice section of today's work. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I want to number the paragraphs first. Should be 7. Yeah. Okay, here's the title. Okay, let's wait for that to straighten up. Alright, I'm starting with paragraph 1. The sharecropping system spread across the South. A few former slaves were able to prosper, but many fell into a cycle of poverty and debt to white landowners. Still, many whites were angry that former slaves were renting land. In Mississippi, white landowners worked to put new laws into effect that made it illegal for white planters to sell or rent land to former slaves. But African Americans didn't give up. Some fought against unfair sharecropping agreements and laws. They formed groups to help educate and support each other. White Southerners feared such groups. Often white mobs attacked gatherings of African Americans. They threatened black leaders. In fact, some white Southerners formed their own special groups to terrorize freed men. One example is the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. At night, members in white robes would attack and often kill African Americans. By 1877, Reconstruction was over. All the federal troops had left the South. White Southerners began to use fear to keep African Americans from voting. The KKK and other terror groups could now act freely. They became strong all across the South, and the southern states passed laws to separate blacks from whites and limit the rights of African Americans. These laws became known as Jim Crow laws. Many former slaves saw their dream of freedom fade. Some African Americans left the South. One group, known as the Exodusters, moved to Kansas. There, they started farms and built communities. A few freedmen even moved back to Africa. Many former slaves stayed in the South, though. Slavery had ended, but true freedom for some time would be out of reach for African Americans. All right, let's go paragraph by paragraph, breaking the text down. So, sharecropping, vocab word we learned about on Monday. This is the system where you work the land in exchange for giving up some of your crops to the person whose land you're working. But a lot of times, the sharecropping system was a trap, and it would get people trapped in a cycle of poverty and debt. Poverty means poor living conditions. And debt means owing money. So not only did they live in poor conditions, they would also owe money lots of times to white landowners. Even though it was a trap, white landowners still didn't like the fact that black people were renting land, so they were trying to put new laws into place to make it illegal for white people to rent land to non-white people. Ridiculous. Okay. This is just, these two paragraphs are kind of connected. It's just background information. Okay, here we go. Paragraph 4. One example of a terror group is the Ku Klux Klan. At night, members with white robes would attack and kill African Americans. Now, this was in response to, This was in response to African Americans building groups to support and educate each other. The KKK is a reaction to those groups. So the KKK is a reaction to black education and opportunity. Though it wasn't a lot of education and a lot of opportunity, it was more than what they had before. So the KKK is created to try and stomp that out before it gets any bigger. Obviously, it fails. Reaction to black education and... what was I going to say here? Opportunity. Okay. Paragraph 5. White Southerners used fear to keep blacks from voting. KKK, now that the soldiers from the North were gone, could act freely. And then eventually southern states passed laws known as Jim Crow laws. What did they do? They separated blacks from whites. This is called segregation. Okay. Paragraph 6. Former slaves saw their dream of freedom fade. And then here's an example of how some African Americans kind of moved past the hardships by literally moving to somewhere completely different. And then this last paragraph, which is just 2 sentences, it gives us an idea of, yes, the slaves are free, but they don't have freedom. They're free from slavery, but they don't have freedom. Slavery had ended, but true freedom for some time would be out of reach. All right, so we've talked to the text. We've kind of broken it down to pick out the most important points. So let's see if we can answer some questions. Okay. All right. How were African Americans kept from gaining power in the South? And I put 2 hints here, paragraph 2 and paragraph 5. So let's look at 2 and let's look at 5. So how were they kept from gaining power? How were African Americans barred from gaining power? They were barred from gaining power by new laws that were put into place. And, yep, new laws, Jim Crow laws. Okay, so here's my sentence starter. I'm just going to write directly on the blank line. When I give you guys sentence starters, you guys can just copy and paste it and then fill in the blank for when we're writing incomplete sentences. So, African Americans were kept from gaining power in the South because of laws that limited their economic and political freedom. And then in parentheses, I'm going to put Jim Crow laws. Okay. Let's use... we can still stick with green. This is number 1. Number 2. How did African Americans continue to try getting a better life? So how did black people kind of move past and look past the hardships that were presented to them? And what are examples from the text that say like how black people try to be even better despite all the bad things happening to them? Here I put, you can find evidence in paragraph 3 and 6. So let's look at 3 and 6. So in paragraph 3, African Americans didn't give up. They fought against unfair sharecropping agreements and laws. Let's look in paragraph 6. Some African Americans left the South. Some moved to Kansas. Some went back to Africa. So, for this first blank here, I want to put it right here. So, African Americans moved to other places and fought bad laws to try and gain a better life. That's the rest of that sentence I already wrote. Now, the second part of this question is providing evidence from the text. I know this because the text says, here is where you would copy and paste directly from the text to provide evidence. So you can copy and paste this and put it in that blank. You can copy and paste this down here in paragraph 6. And that would be okay as evidence that would support our statement of African Americans moved to other places and fought bad laws to try and gain a better life. All right, there's a lot on the board right now. I'm going to go ahead and clear it so we can answer our last 2 questions. Oh. Okay. And if you didn't get a chance to see everything that I had written, y'all can always pause the video. Okay. All right, here's the last 2 sets of questions. This is number 3. This is number 4. Okay. What was the KKK and what did they do? Copy and paste evidence. Hold on. Paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the only paragraph that talks about the KKK is paragraph 5. So what was the KKK? It said the KKK and other terror groups, which means the KKK is a what? A terror group. Okay, so that's what it was. Now, what did they do? They used fear to keep African Americans from voting, and they would often attack and kill African Americans. So in this first blank, just like question number 2, I would put the KKK is and was a terror group that terrorized blacks nationwide, all across the country. That's what I put in that blank, and then I know this because the text says, and then you would be okay in copying down anything in paragraph 5 that talks about the KKK, or this example right here, the last sentence in paragraph 4, that gives you an example of some of the things they would do to African Americans. Okay, I'm going to do the last question in yellow, just so it can look a little different. Question number 4. What were Jim Crow laws? So we're looking for that phrase in the text, and then it says copy and paste evidence. That lets us know that we're right. So the only place I see Jim Crow is, again, paragraph 5. Let's read the sentence that we can find this phrase in. And southern states passed laws to separate blacks from whites and limit rights of African Americans. These laws became known as Jim Crow laws. So what were Jim Crow laws? Jim Crow laws were laws that limited the rights, spaces, and opportunities for blacks. Let me explain what I mean when I say that. The rights, obviously, what you are legally allowed to do. The spaces. So it limited the spaces that blacks could be in. So this is the beginning of segregation, where white people have their own water fountain and people of color have their own water fountain. White people have their own entrance into a restaurant. Colored people have a separate entrance into the restaurant. That's what I mean when I say spaces. And then opportunities is pretty obvious. There's not a lot of opportunity to make money and become rich as a black person, especially right after Reconstruction. Then you would put, I know this because the text says, and then the only thing I would be okay with accepting is this yellow line that I underlined here, because the text said Jim Crow laws were laws to separate blacks from whites, yada, yada, yada. So that's how I would go about going through 1 through 4. If you have a different way but arrive at the same answer, that's 100% okay. What you're going to do for your independent practice is you're going to create a story or a poem or a rap using 6 vocabulary words that kind of breaks down the things we've been learning about in a more creative way. So check out the next video on Mr. Lopez's version of that assignment so you can compare yours to his to see if you're doing a good job or if you're on the right track. See y'all there.